Jess, and I'm the director and curator here of the Dorset Historical Society. And so I'm really excited to bring this lunchtime lecture to you featuring historian and archaeologist Joseph Kinney, who's exploring Revolutionary War era forts of Rutland County and how they've been remembered or forgotten over time. So drawing from his undergraduate thesis and ongoing research, Joseph's going to introduce us to key military sites, including Castleton's Fort Warren, Pittsford's Fort Vengeance, and Rutland's Forts Rutland and Ranger. So a little bit about him. Joseph Kinney earned his BA in history from Castleton University in 2023, where he participated in the Castleton Hidden History Project. He currently works as a field archaeologist for Heritage Consultants in Connecticut and is pursuing a master's degree in historical archaeology at UMass Boston. His research interests focus on New England's Revolutionary War and early federal period history and material culture. His most recent work explores the 1777 skirmish of Castleton, which is an event closely tied to the construction of Fort Warren. And so you can learn more about what we've got going on at DHS, our mission, our collections, and our events, of course, at dorsetbthistory.org. But without further ado, please join me in welcoming Joseph today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the great introduction, Jess. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me here. Good afternoon, and thanks for having me at the Historical Society this morning or this afternoon. And of course, thank you for having me and bringing this research to you today. As Jess said, my name is Joseph Kinney. I'm a graduate student at UMass Boston studying historical archaeology. I'm very happy to share with you this research from my undergraduate honors thesis, The Lost Forts of Rutland County, a discussion of public memory of the American Revolution. Before we get too into the weeds, I want to catch us up on some historical timeline for these forts. We'll be covering the towns of Castleton, Rutland, and Pittsford, which were chartered and lightly settled in the 1760s. Of course, we all note that the American Revolutionary War began in 1775, and at the same time, the forts, Fort Rutland in center Rutland and Fort Mott in Pittsford were constructed to defend those localities. The war reached a fever pitch in Vermont in 1777 with the British capture of Fort Ticonderoga and Mount Independence, as well as the lesser-known skirmish between Vermont militiamen and a British scouting party in Castleton on July 6th, followed by the famous Battle of Hubbardton, which I'm sure we're all aware of. Incursions like these inspired Castleton citizens to begin construction on Fort Warren in 1778, and for the Vermont Board of War to declare a military front between the enemy and the inhabitants, defined as the north line of Castleton and the west and north lines of Pittsford. Pittsford erected a second fort, Fort Vengeance, to replace Fort Mott in 1780 after the killing of a white settler, Caleb Houghton, at the hands of a native warrior. In 1781, Fort Warren was moved to Hydeville, and the war ended in 1783. And about that time, all of the forts were decommissioned, deconstructed, or otherwise abandoned. And so I thrown this handy map together to illustrate where the forts were located relative to each other. And so you'll find Fort Warren and Castleton to the west there, and Forts Vengeance, Rutland, and Ranger to the east. Fort Warren was built at the present intersection of East Hubbardton Road, which is the old military road to Hubbardton, and 4A. Fort Rutland was built at the intersection of present-day Main and Terrell Streets in center Rutland, and Fort Ranger at Meads Falls, and Fort Vengeance to the west of present-day Route 7, just south of the downtown there.
Now, excuse me.
Yes.
Ticonderoga is where?
It's further, yep, it's off the map. It's further west across from Mount Independence.
And the Battle of Bennington all took place south?
Way south of where we are. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Straight now. Thank you.
No problem. So with the usual capacity of 150 to 200 persons, the purpose of these forts was to protect the Vermont interior from foreign threats experienced in the Revolutionary War, like the British and native incursions that often probed Vermont defenses, such as the skirmish of Castleton in 1777. As you can see by these illustrations by historians and one by yours truly, these forts were frontier posts and not permanent defenses like larger other fortresses like Fort Ticonderoga. They were constructed with walls of sunken, hewn logs, typically containing dwellings or other interior buildings like a storehouse or blockhouse, and sometimes had defensive structures like blockhouses that gave soldiers a protected position for musket fire. although temporary installations, holdovers from the fort's service years manifested in the first era of public remembrance. In the early post-war years, the public reused fort material for their own purposes. The first instances of this occurred in Rutland and Castleton shortly after the war. In Rutland, it was reported that Fort Ranger became a meeting place for locals, and the storehouse at Fort Warren in Castleton was perhaps used as an impromptu chapel by the town's Congregational Society before their first church was built in 1790. However, most interesting is the case of Fort Vengeance's barracks being used as a residence in 1790 by Caleb Hendy Jr. Fort Vengeance was built on his father, Caleb Hendy Sr.'s land, which he leased to the Vermont troops in 1780. The Vermont troops were not the greatest tenants, as they deconstructed Hendy's house and destroyed his farm in the process of constructing the fort, using all of his shingles and boards and nails to construct the barracks. And so he came back after the war ended and found his farm in disarray and his house kind of gone, So he petitioned the state 4 times for recompense, and all of which were denied. So his son just moved into the barracks instead. Besides the physical structures, equipment from the forts was also reused by the public in the post-war era. Although small frontier posts, the forts nonetheless possessed artillery, one piece of which was reused by Rutland citizens in an 1803 4th of July celebration. These would have been like maybe 3 or 6 pound caliber small little cannons. In 1803, Castleton residents put on an independence ball to celebrate Independence Day, and an invitation of which you'd see at the center top of the slide there. Many residents from surrounding towns were invited and traveled to Castleton to participate in the day's activities, but some folks in Rutland stayed behind and put on their own celebration. To close their day of activities, a cannon, previously of one of Revolutionary War forts from the county, was rolled out and to be discharged. Instead of using the normal load, those in Rutland overloaded the cannon so that the blast may be heard in Castleton, 10 miles away or thereabouts. The cannon unexpectedly exploded and burst into huge pieces at touch-off, killing the young man who volunteered to carry out the detonation. Moving past the tragic cannon explosion, fort materials were reused to mend a historic artifact in Castleton. By the 1860s, the grounds of Fort Warren had become plow fields, owned by one Celia Langdon. Langdon had come into possession of the Burgoyne kettle, which is pictured on the right, a kettle provenienced as a war prize captured from Burgoyne's camp at Stillwater after the Saratoga campaign concluded. The kettle bore a crack when Langdon acquired it, and so being a former metallurgist, he took to repairing it. Being that the Fort Warren grounds were a plow field, several pieces of iron cannon shot ammunition had been turned up over the decades of plowing, and Langdon melted down some of those pieces to mend the kettle, forever infusing the British and American artifacts. As the last generation of Vermonters who personally remembered the forts faded into history and gave way to the next wholly post-fort generations of historians, the forts began to be remembered for their legacy, manifesting several forms of cultural entanglement for the next century. Like we are currently experiencing in the 2020s with the 250th or semi-quincentennial of American independence coming up in 2026, the 1870s saw a similar surge in patriotic interest, mainly to do with the centennial of American independence coming up in 1876. The centennial and its celebrations spawned several heritage organizations, such as the Sons of the Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, and the Daughters of the American Revolution. It was in their mission statements to commemorate places of historical significance, and thus, sites around the country received historical markers. Fort Vengeance received its own marker in 1873 by the efforts of Pittsford residents. Its dedication was attended by 1,500 persons and completed with historical orations and 13-gun salute. And the marker serves to mark the site of the fort as well as the burial site of Caleb Houghton, who was killed in 1780, which gave the fort's name. After the Ann Story chapter of the DER, or Rutland County chapter, was founded in 1892, the other forts received their own markers. Fort Rutland got its own marker in 1901, then Fort Ranger in 1903, and finally Fort Warren in 1904. These were simple markers, usually only bearing the names of the forts, a quick sentence or two about their function, and finally relevant dates when they were built and such. These roadside memorials were the beginning of public commemoration of the forts and represent the public's awareness of the history of the historic sites in the early 20th century. When patriotic fervor experienced a resurgence as the United States entered the Second World War, the public's awareness and interest in the forts becomes clear as their names were invoked in promoting morale on the home front. One key example of this is the publishing of the Fort Vengeance Flyer, as was called, by the Pittsford Housekeepers Club between 1942 and 1945. This newsletter was created to be sent abroad to Pittsford-born soldiers, keeping them informed on happenings at home, but also reminding them of how their fight overseas harkens back to the defense of Pittsford during the Revolutionary War. The opening issue, which is pictured here, 1942, reads, "Did you know that old Fort Vengeance was a place of refuge from Indian attacks years ago? Did you know in 1777 there was a committee of safety in town? Did you know that the present observation post for town is right near the first fort in town, and that watchers are there 24 hours of every day? Did you know that the Housekeepers Club of Pittsford wants every Pittsford and Florence boy in the services to know that we of the Sunshine Village are backing you up and are sending you news through this Fort Vengeance flyer? Here it is." While the newsletter contained only local information, usually marriages, deaths, or how the war was affecting local sports teams, a parallel was nonetheless drawn between the fight of Pittsford settlers in the 1770s and 80s and the fight of Pittsford soldiers in the 1940s, all in the spirit of Fort Vengeance. At the same time that the name of Fort Vengeance was invoked on the home front, the public interest in and in turn the fort's potential for commercialization was being capitalized upon. Contemporary entrepreneurs and local leaders alike saw opportunity in the public's recent engagement with the forts and attempted to cash in on the interest. This is seen in Rutland in 1939 as the Rotary Club there proposed to reconstruct Fort Rutland and Fort Ranger as potential revenue streams for the city to take advantage of the annual waves of tourism brought in by the ski mountains. This proposal never materialized, of course, as the forts were ever rebuilt. Likewise, Fort Vengeance's image was commercialized as the National Life Insurance Company of Vermont drew a parallel between the fight of women defending the fort in the 1780s to the contemporary fight of women against modern insecurity, that being by buying life insurance policies. In their Protecting the American Home campaign, they used an illustration of women in colonial dress shooting from behind the cover of the fort's walls and on the firing step at presumably native foes as arrows can be seen flying overhead, making clear their historical analogy. I have the picture blown up for you here on the right side. Fort Warren in Castleton was also not without commercialization, as its name was invoked as the namesake for several local businesses throughout the latter half of the 20th century. First by the Fort Warren Drive-In Theater between 1949 and 1980, and then by the Fort Warren Motel and Restaurant from 59 to 73, and finally by the still existing Fort Warren Trailer Park since 1970. These businesses invoked the Fort Warren name less for any kind of thematic reason, but more to denote their proximity to the historic post, as all of these businesses were located within a quarter mile or within sight of the old plateau that Fort Warren was built upon. I have a second shot here of the Fort Warren Motel and Restaurant, a little panoramic from UVM, thankfully, from the 60s. And so you can see it has this big sign, but it's really just a business. There's no like cannons outside or anything, you know. At the same time that local business owners were attempting to make a buck off of the renewed interest in the forts, the general public themselves celebrated their history by adopting them as monikers for local organizations. And before I forget, this is where the trailer park is here. I almost forgot to show that. In the 1950s and 60s, the Fort Vengeance 4-H Club in Pittsford and the Fort Ranger 4-H Club in Rutland adopted their local forts names for their clubs. Although using their name, their activities did not stray away from anything that typical 4-H clubs did at the time, like monthly meetings, camping trips, forestry projects, and Christmas parties. They simply honored the forts by adopting their namesake. Perhaps the climax of interest in the forts in the mid-20th century, and in Fort Vengeance in particular, materialized as the Pittsford Pageant 1758 to 1959. From July 5th through 8th, 1959, Pittsford hosted a local celebration as part of the larger Champlain Festival. Alongside exhibits, luncheons, parties, one of the main draws to this festival was a reenactment by locals of historical scenes from Fort Vengeance. The reenacted scenes included iconic moments from Fort Vengeance's history, like the death of Caleb Houghton and the capture of Betsy Cox by natives, and illustrate what the public of the 20th century found most important to remember of the forts, that is, their town's connection to the enemy incursions of the Revolutionary War. The Pittsford pageant illustrates how the Rutland County public engaged with and remembered the Revolutionary War history, with themes of patriotism, honor, and pride in their heritage prevailing. However, the pageant also reveals the ways in which the fort's memory was used to support narratives of race. Prior to the event, volunteers were needed as actors to fill various scene roles, and advertisements requested persons for, quote, Indian and pioneer roles. A small choir will sing in the war sequence, and 2 horsewomen are needed for Betsy Cox scene, end quote. Actors portraying the Indians, I have a couple pictures on the left and right there flanking the central advertisement, were dressed in culturally appropriated clothing that reflected stereotypical understandings of Native American dress. Pictured actors can be seen wearing large feathered war bonnets, full face paint, and other generalized traits of American natives. It is important to note that these scenes performed in the pageant were exclusively patriotic ones. The public avoided histories that might challenge the fort's benign memory, as the reenactment of the destruction of Caleb Henry's farm by the Vermont troops in 1780 was not in the pageant's playbill. The pageant shows that where the public honored the stories of early Pittsford settlers like Betsy Cox and the Fort Vengeance soldiers, they did so at the sacrifice of public perception of colonial-era Native Americans. Thinking back to the 1873 Fort Vengeance marker dedication, between then and the pageant, the public memory of Fort Vengeance evolved from the somber dedication of the monument to Caleb Houghton's murder by Native Americans to young Pittsford boys dressed as the very natives that the fort sought to defend against, reenacting the murder as part of its spectacle. And one must ask if this timeline of the evolution of public memory of the forts is solely a Vermont phenomenon, and of course it is not. Looking at other contemporary forts, such as Fort Stanwix in western New York and Fort Boonesborough in frontier Kentucky, these colonial posts received similar treatment by their constituents in similar time intervals as the Rutland County forts here. These forts received site marker memorials at the turn of the century, were commercialized by entrepreneurs with their own local businesses, and celebrated by local groups in the 20th century with namesake organizations and reenactments. While their publics remembered them similarly, the same cannot be said for their fates. Excuse me, what's going on here? There we are. Both Fort Stanwix and Fort Boonesborough have since been rebuilt as Fort Stanwix National Park and Fort Boonesborough Kentucky State Park, respectively. And now we turn to Rutland County again. The question then remains as to why these historic forts, with all of their centuries of local relevance and significance, slipped through the cracks of time. While it can be argued that urban development and the lack of state protection led to the erasure of the forts, the same challenges were overcome by Fort Stanwix in Rome, New York. And as part of Rome's historic district, it had to be razed to rebuild Fort Stanwix. And perhaps
The site of Fort Rutland, what's the highway?
this is South Main Street right here. And this is Main Street in Center Rutland.
Okay, Main Street.
Yep, and then kind of out of view, but it's Terrell Street is crossing it. And so the marker for the fort is right at that intersection there. And then over here, so I guess while we're on it, so Castleton's fort, the site, this is East Hubbardton Road and Route 4A, Main Terrell Street. We're up on Route 7 here for Fort Vengeance, and this is right next to Route 3 and Meads Falls by Old Business 4 at Fort Ranger. But perhaps the forts were really not significant enough to be rebuilt. But another frontier, Fort Boonesborough, was also, it was rebuilt, and it was still a frontier fort. Similar to the Rutland County forts, Boonesborough represents early white settlement and expansion into frontier America, but be it in the Kentucky region or the Vermont landscape. The exact reasoning why the forts have been forgotten is a question that warrants its own investigation, with research likely having to assess why people preserve sites in the first place. Unlike frontier posts like Stanwix and Boonesborough, Rutland County forts were not the sites of landmark Indian treaties or expansion into the Appalachians, respectively. Perhaps it could be that these fort sites, in their locally bound significance, have been overshadowed by one of the only preserved Revolutionary War sites in Vermont, the Hubbardton Battlefield. This is evidenced by Fort Warren's own Vermont State Historic Site marker, which does more to narrate the history of the battle than the fort that's supposed to mark. It reads, quote, Fort Warren, Battle of Hubbardton, that's the wrong page, 7 miles north. Directly east is the elevation of Fort Warren, built in 1779 for defense of the northern frontier, which was the name for the front. The road from the north was route of American retreat before Burgoyne, protected by Colonel Seth Warner's rearguard action at the Battle of Hubbardton, July 7th, 1777. And to top it off, the sign features a silver feathered arrow just below the text, pointing towards the battlefield on the bottom there, if you see it. And this feature is not found on other markers. This is only on this marker that I've seen. Yet the Rutland County forts still offer something for us in the spirit of the ongoing Vermont 250 and America 250 movement. The evolution of the Rutland County fort's public memory connects us to broader national trends in historical memory, as per the similarities they share with other forts in the country, like the aforementioned Stanwix and Boonesborough. Thus, despite the fort's local significance, they are nonetheless relevant as reminders to us present-day researchers that there is still merit in rediscovering our own local histories, as they altogether help inform us of our nation's heritage and memory thereof. And I think that's worth studying. Thank you for joining me. Thank you very much. And this is all published in my recent article with Vermont History. And I have a addressed copy for Jess and the Society for you, for your library.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. I guess if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them or try to answer them.
But there was never a battle fought at Fort Rutland.
No, there were no dramatic incursions or skirmishes. Perhaps Fort Warren, and these were all built to just be like a deterrent and guard the localities. But it was those kinds of probes, like the Castleton skirmish for the Battle of Hubbardton, or Caleb Potton's death, that prompted them to build these forts and just have a defense for future attacks.
And so there were no, even during the Revolutionary War, there was no permanent military establishment there. Were there soldiers or?
There were soldiers. They would circulate between the four forts. You would have militia companies from all across Vermont would come in and out. There were officers who were more sedentary, like quartermasters and commissary men, who would be there all the time, of course, as officers. But the privates and militiamen would sometimes circulate around. Yeah. But the forts did, and they fulfilled other duties. Like Fort Warren would commute prisoners sometimes from prisoners of war that were captured, maybe on scouting missions, and there's records of that in all the walls of those books upstairs. So while they didn't defend any big battle per se, they still had military roles during the war. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, that's very good.
No.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else? Good. Any questions, Jess? I threw a lot at you, so I know,
Good. Thank you so much.